All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I'm very excited and motivated to talk about Candide. I will speak from my own personal experience that reading it this time was an entirely different experience for me for two reasons. The most important of which was the context you established for it, and reading it through that lens changed the experience of reading it completely. And then also this time I did the work of making reference to the footnotes in the chapters, at least where it seemed really significant to read the footnote. And so I feel like the combination of your context setting and the footnotes gave me both why he was satirizing the culture, and then what about it. The footnotes gave me what about it specifically he was satirizing. So I definitely got a lot more out of it this time, and I appreciate.
Sorry, we lost you, Lisa, for a second. Can you unmute?
Yes. How would you like to approach the conversation? I have lots of notes and thoughts and questions myself. I'm sure other people came prepared with thoughts and questions, but do you have an idea for how you'd like to structure it?
No, I'd like to make just a couple of introductory remarks and then go to discussion and see where people take me.
Okay.
Uh, uh, First, I want to give some context to the treatment of clergy and the nature of the clergy who show up in Voltaire's Candide. Uh, the Catholic Church in France is in many ways revivified by persecution during the French Revolution. It has become a remarkably corrupt institution by the 18th century, and Voltaire and his audience are being reminded again and again about the problems with the church. Let me set a context. In England, every son of an aristocrat is excuse me, in England, only the eldest son, firstborn son of an aristocrat inherits family estate and family title. And second born, third born, fourth born sons, until they're, due to a death in the family, called to aristocratic status, they are simply prestigious commoners and can engage in commerce and trade and the professions and politics. In France, every child of an aristocrat is an aristocrat, which creates very pressing family strategy dilemmas. Your eldest son, if he does not inherit everything, is much poorer than his father. And if you divide family fortune and estate and land and wealth among 6, 7 children, that is a family that's impoverished in 1 or 2 generations. Because in France, if an aristocrat engages in a profession or trade, he loses his aristocratic status. To vivre noblement, to live like a nobleman in France, means not to engage in labor or commerce or productive work. And now the problem for a family is you must find placement for the children you love and who carry your name. The eldest son will receive the aristocratic title, but also will receive extraordinary wealth, the entire family fortune in England, but here only if you take care of the other sons. So, what do aristocrats do? One son can make a fortune by going into the army. You'll have 18 or 19-year-old sons of aristocrats being named colonel of regiment and rising in the ranks very quickly. One of the best placements you can make for a child, if you are an aristocrat, is into the church. It's a source of wealth, it's a source of income, And it is very common for aristocratic families to have a son named an abbot of a monastery, an abbot of land. Um, you will find 20, 25-year-old bishops in the French Catholic Church. You place colonels, bishops, you place your children in the church. As a result, there are an extraordinary number of ambitious, worldly, sexually active, well-bred young men, priests, abbots, receiving great wealth, hiring usually a commoner to do the actual labor for them of running a diocese in the case of bishop, organizing monastic lands in the case of an abbot. Very often, you have aristocratic non-resident clergy who receive income and give maybe a 20th of that to some lower born priest to actually conduct the spiritual life of a parish or indeed a diocese. So the corruption and the sexual activities that Voltaire shows and attributes to clergy is not unknown as experience to his readers, but it's almost never stated and presented with such sarcasm and with such contempt and so casually. So you meet the daughter of a pope in the old lady. So syphilis is given to people by the priests and monks they sleep with. Voltaire is highlighting in a way that makes people wince and laugh as they read him in the 18th century. And as I hope I suggested in the questions I had circulated, just think on it. If you have laughed at something you before considered sacred, you've changed the way the reader thinks about it. If Voltaire gets you to chuckle at popes and clergy, he has changed the nature of your religiosity. The second last thing I should talk about before we get into discussion is how many real events Voltaire scatters through Candide. As picaresque, as fantastical as parts of Candide read, some of those are absolutely true, and the mixture of the fantastical and the picaresque with the true being often yet more startling than anything that he's fabricated in the novel. So what's real? The Lisbon earthquake is real. The auto da fe, the act of faith, which is to say the burning of Jews and heretics, with which they are going to deal with the anger of God that led to the Lisbon earthquake, that is absolutely real. He is describing what the Inquisition in Lisbon did to restore God's favor on the city. The Jesuits in Portugal is absolutely real. The Jesuit missionaries in Brazil, excuse me, the Jesuit missionaries in Portuguese Brazil created an empire, enslaved the tribes, formed local armies with indigenous peoples, and virtually were at war with armies sent by the crown of Spain and then the crown of Portugal to deal with them. It begins a disillusionment in Europe with the Jesuits and an anger in Europe toward the Jesuits that will culminate in their expulsion from France, from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy, from parts of the Italian states. So that is wholly real. The actresses who cannot be buried, that is absolutely real. The church has deemed certain people unfit to be buried in sacred, hallowed ground. That includes heretics whose bodies are thrown in heaps, dung heaps, outside of the walls of Paris. that includes actresses. It is a profession deemed immoral, feigning love, women feigning emotions on the stage. It is deemed an immoral activity. The church does not allow actresses and to be buried in sacred ground, and Voltaire is extremely admiring and fond of some of the leading actresses in France. He is, after all, a playwright in most people's mind, first and foremost. So that is wholly real. I'll stop there just to give you a sense of how he has scattered absolutely historically accurate events in the midst of these fantastical, picaresque discussions and narratives. And now I'm interested in where you want to go. Did my questions circulate?
Yes, they did.
Shall I read them really quickly just to get them out?
Absolutely.
In your responses to these, and you can hear each other with similar or different takes on the same question. Best part of teaching is hearing those sorts of things. First, what role does the utopia of El Dorado play in Candide? What in the world is a utopia doing in the midst of an anti-utopian, anti-optimistic tale? So what's Voltaire doing with the whole sequence of El Dorado? If Pangloss all words, all tongue, Pangloss, literally what it means. If Pangloss represents the philosophical view that given God's perfection, this must be the best of all possible worlds, and everything that happens in it happens for a necessary good reason, in what ways does Voltaire attempt to refute such a philosophy? With another how in the world question, how in the world does one refute a formal philosophical argument in a tale? And he does it quite successfully in terms of the response of a culture to Leibniz and now to Voltaire. How would you characterize Voltaire's strategies? What does the opinion that the Enlightenment holds a wildly optimistic view of human nature, how does that hold up through a reading of Candide? And in Candide, what kinds of people tend to commit atrocities of various kinds, and who tend to be the victims of them? 18th century readers laughed at so many of Voltaire's barbs and satires. It is one of the reasons he had such a major audience. And he mocks so much that readers had been taught to praise and admire, often with awe. Aristocracy, clergy, royal courts, military heroes. What are the objects of his satire? And how would you characterize his satirical techniques? Since the 18th century, people have asked that question. What is Voltairean satire? What is Voltairean wit that changes minds? And if you have 1,000 people, there are 1,000 different ways of answering that. So how would you characterize his satirical techniques? Let's get on to discussion.
Okay. Well, I could certainly take up all his time asking questions and sharing thoughts myself. So I think I'll stifle my own and offer the floor to other people who want to get started. But if you don't, I'm content to get things started myself. Anybody itching
Maybe
to
just a logistical thing, just raise your hand if you do want to jump in.
Or feel free to make comments in the chat. Well, okay, I'll get us started with one thing. So in terms of the question of the style of his satire, I made a list, and and tried to find examples of all the different kinds of humor. It seems like no holds barred humor here because there was a great variety as far as I could tell. So um, I don't know what to call. I don't feel very competent to discuss comedy. Comedy seems like an art of its own, and it's hard to analyze for me. But one element seemed like the unexpected or the non sequitur. Like there would be a sentence I would be reading, and then it would shift at the end in a way that I completely didn't see coming. Um,
I think that's at the heart of a lot of the satirical technique that he uses. And it's also part, I think, of what may be the most dramatically successful part of Voltaire as a polemicist. He lays things out, but he doesn't draw the conclusion. He doesn't make the moral what follows from this. He sets things out, but it's the reader who has to draw the conclusion. When he gives us a Spanish aristocrat whose name goes on for 2 lines with family names, right? Y Lampadoso, y Ortega, the pretension of the European aristocracy is absolutely out there, but he's just given it casually as an ordinary name. And it's the reader who has to draw the conclusion from that. You have, after descriptions of the most extraordinary brutality in that stunning chapter on war, and at the end of that chapter, he will just casually say, Candide trembled like a philosopher. Nothing about philosophy faced with human suffering, human tragedy. Just let the reader draw the conclusion. You get to see a Te Deum. That's a mass in praise and thanks of God. A Te Deum is a thanksgiving mass, thanking God for something he has just given or granted. Well, those Te Deum masses, and that is when Te Deum masses tended to occur, are celebrating military victories. Right? That is, you've had the gruesome slaughter of village after village, and then Te Deums by both armies that participated in the mutual slaughter. Voltaire doesn't say, this is how religion praises God. This is what we see as a gift from God. The reader has to draw all the conclusions. That's a dramatic technique.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I think this philosophy of the best of all possible worlds sounds like the pinnacle of rationalism at the time. Like this is, they're constructing these arguments disconnected from reality. And my sense is Voltaire is just ripping the lid off of that, right? He's exposing that for the implications it actually means. And when you say this did change people's minds, was it the intellectuals of the time, or was it the commoners who were actually living in this reality? Who did it have the most impact on?
The phrase "the best of all possible worlds" becomes a term of ridicule. And after Candide is out there in the world, when people are dealing with a God has a reason for everything philosophy, it is very, very common for people to write in letters, indeed to say it becomes one of the most common terms of ridicule, the best of all possible worlds, which, and you're exactly right, that it's for Leibniz and for Leibniz's devotees who are legion in the first half of the 18th century, and almost no one is defending the theodicy after the publication of Candide. It is very dramatic, the effect of this work. You're absolutely right that it's presented as logical, but not in the mind of the people. We're saying this is an unavoidable logical conclusion, given God, that this must be the best of all possible worlds. It's detached from empirical evidence because you don't need empirical evidence. If it's a triangle, it has three sides. Someone says to you, come see a four-sided triangle, you say that's a logical contradiction. Right? Come see a circle that's 340 degrees, not a circle. The logic of the argument is reality for the people making that argument. And someone who said, no, but look at the evils that people experience in the world, those are the people detached from reality, if the reality is an awareness that, given the infinite goodness of a God who created, this must be the best of all possible worlds. The notion that God created the 12th best possible world being a logical absurdity. So if you think to the example I gave 2 weeks ago, what you would do if someone called you up, friend calls you up and says, come on over to my backyard, I've got two parallel lines that are crossing. And you say, no, parallel lines don't cross. And that person says, well, Joseph, if you want to be detached from reality and not look at evidence, right, that's your choice. But I'm embedded in reality, and parallel lines in reality don't cross. God, logically, in reality, obviously has created the best of all possible worlds. Everything else is a logical absurdity. And there's Voltaire successfully convincing readers that that position involves them in absurdity. A remarkable thing.
Can I share a favorite quote to capture that idea? So that's one of the things that I noted was what just felt like deliberately ironic juxtapositions, putting things very close together that would highlight this issue. But anyway, on page 88 in this version, it says, "Now tell us this, my dear Pangloss," said Candide. "While you were being hanged and dissected and beaten and made to row in a galley, did you continue to believe that all was for the best?" "I hold firmly to my original views," replied Pangloss. "I am a philosopher, after all. It would not do for me to recant, given that Leibniz is incapable of error and that pre-established harmony is, moreover, the finest thing in the world."
Yes, it's just wonderful that how do you get people to change their minds about dogmatic metaphysical philosophers? How about presenting one who's being hanged, who's been given syphilis, who's falling apart, who's experienced nothing but misery, and who says, no, 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 I have to hold to my view that this is the best of all possible worlds. I'm a philosopher. We can't change our minds. And you're an ordinary reader, and suddenly the title of you're a philosopher doesn't quite mean the same thing. Oh, you're one of those dogmatic people who never changes a mind, no matter what's being offered against something. Suddenly you've changed the way readers think about philosophers, even as august as Leibniz.
One of the lines that stood out for me too is he understood from everything he had learned about Candide that here was a young metaphysician entirely unschooled in the ways of the world.
Yeah.
So the sentiment that they are just disconnected from.
Also, just that refrain of it came back again and again, so it made me laugh harder every time. Oh, Pangloss would love this if only he hadn't been hanged, or if only he hadn't been hanged, this would confirm his view, as a refrain.
And again, if the reader discovers that you sound very, very foolish, you sound preposterous, making arguments that you thought all educated, brilliant people believed, you have really changed minds of your readers. Nick, your hand up.
Yes.
Rosado?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, kind of going off of this, I might ask, like, what do you think of Candide just as a person? Because even though he has a lot wrong with him, Lisa Barr's negativity, um, I kind of want to know, like, mm, I personally find him kind of likable because he's very honest and he shows his emotions unabashedly, which is incidentally why I kind of really like Achilles because he shows his emotions all the time. But of course, he's naive, he's self-selective in what he chooses to focus on. He has artless simplicity when he talks to Cunegande and he recounts everything that happens to him. He justifies evil, all the private ills are indispensable. But still, I kind of do like him. Like he seems like a good person. So what do you think? What do you think?
It's very, very, what your question is wonderfully interesting. Um, uh, One piece of info, when Ira Wade, whom I talked about 2 weeks ago, the greatest of all Voltaire scholars, discovered the actual manuscript of revisions being made by Voltaire to Candide. What became obvious, and it changed the way one thinks about Voltaire during this period he's writing Candide, the only work that takes him forever, the only work he can't finish, the only moment in his life when there's a writer's block. And what's obvious, as Wade points out in a brilliant book called Voltaire and Candide, is through most of the writing of Candide, it is Martin the Manichean who is going to be Voltaire's voice. That a more likely inference from the stuff of the world that is that there are equal forces of good and evil, creation and destruction in the world. Manichaeanism is a belief that the world is inexplicable by the hypothesis of one infinitely good God, that there are two gods, if you will, two forces in the world, evil and good. And they war down here below. And that was the Manichaean heresy, which was extirpated in early modern France and late medieval France by the sword. It was actually a very powerful heresy. It's an interesting inference, right? What makes sense of the world? Yeah, there are some things that are adapted, and then there are some things that fall apart and parasitically destroy other things. Looks like there are two forces at work. So Martin the Manichaean emerges because Voltaire needs him. He's skeptical. He can be cynical. He's clear thinking. He describes things as they are. And he is going to be Voltaire's voice. And then he abandons Martin as his voice for being as lost in metaphysics as anyone else could be. And it shifts over to Candide, who gives us the conclusion of the book. Yeah, we'll try to figure out this world. I don't think we're ever going to do it. And in the meantime, beautifully said, your speculative theories, irrelevant. We must cultivate our garden. That's Candide's conclusion. As you rightly point out, Candide is an everyman, not a philosopher. He's not wise. He's an everyman. Candid, spontaneous, and he gets the final word. He gets the moral lesson of the book. That's well said. Il faut cultiver notre jardin. We must cultivate our garden.
And would you just like, I mean, that's a good insight into it. I didn't even think about who gets the final say in the book. It's a good point. But I like just, do you like him though, Candy? Like, do you just as a character, as if he was real, do you find him
I think we're supposed to see him as foolish, easily duped, but he's a stand-in for ordinary human beings who are abused in the world, duped in the world, robbed in the world, deceived. Candide goes through all of that. But he reaches in the end for Voltaire a wiser conclusion than speculative Martin or speculative Pangloss. We're here. This is our condition. And let's cultivate it for humanity. Let's cultivate it for ourselves. I would also add to that sense of cultivation of the garden, the extraordinary meeting with the dervish and the contented family toward the end, right? The wisest dervish, who asked, how could all of these things be happening? Shuts the door. What does that matter to you, whether you know why things happen? And then the one contented family. And it's interesting as we shift from an aristocratic view of the world and life, to a more rising productive class view of life, that cultivation of a garden, becomes the metaphor for how do we stave off our despair over the nature of the creation, the nature of the cosmos, the phantasmagoria that human beings live through, and the contented family. You must have a vast and magnificent estate, said Candide to the Turk. This is the family they've met who are satisfied in life. I have but 20 acres, replied the Turk. I cultivate them with my children. Our work keeps at bay the three great evils: boredom, vice, and necessity. Working to satisfy real, actual human needs and desires, that's the antidote to boredom, to vice, and feeling that everything one does is of a necessity to survive. That celebration of cultivation and human work is actually a spectacular lesson to Voltaire's audience. Responded to. That becomes one of the most quoted lines, how to keep at bay, quote, the three great evils: boredom, vice, and necessity, scarcity. I see hands up.
Sabine?
I was just wondering, he's making fun of the idea that this world we live in, is the best of all worlds, and yet miraculous things happen, like the fact that Pangloss was not hanged and Cunégonde comes back to him in some bizarre way, and I understand that all these terrible things happen in the interim, but the things that Candide most hoped would happen are the things that were most essential to his happiness did take place. And so doesn't that undermine Voltaire's argument?
Right? If the argument is above all else, an extended reflection on being philosophically optimistic in a world of so much pain and suffering and mutual harm, then Candide's dissatisfaction being one of the things that he must come to terms with, makes it a yet broader portrait of the human condition, of the actual real world in which people find themselves. Candide obsesses all he needs in life is Cunégonde, a word, by the way, in French, in 18th century French, that sounds mildly obscene. But all he wants in life is Cunégonde. And when he finally is with her, she's become ugly and a hag, and he has very little interest in her except There is no way he's not going to marry her, given that her brother wouldn't let him marry her because he lacked what she had, 72 quarterings, parents and grandparents, 72 quarterings of nobility in her family history. So it's not only that Candide doesn't get the thing he is most obsessively searched for throughout the whole novel. When he gets it, it's not really all that satisfying. And indeed, his main satisfaction is a little resentment toward the brother. I think Voltaire may well be saying, indeed, isn't life like that? You finally get what you have obsessively sought, and it doesn't really give you to your satisfaction. And that sense that the things that ought to give us joy don't is maybe most dramatic. And now think of it theologically. Think of it theologically. What Voltaire makes sure you catch, it comes up several times. Right? What's a solace in the world? A solace in the world of sexual intimacy. Right? The world can have us down, beaten, we're persecuted, we're robbed, we're abused, but you can make love. You can feel that intimacy, that warmth, that joy, and get syphilis. What a gift from the gods. Love, sex, a solace anyone can have. And what does it lead to? Syphilis, gonorrhea. Your nose starts to decay. You become demented. Happy solace. So things should end on a bad note for Candide. And he comes to terms with them with the sense of, I'm not going to understand God's ways in the world. It has nothing to do with the human condition. And if we turn to the human condition, let's cultivate our garden. Have I gone tangentially far away from the question you asked, or have I in any way gotten close to it?
No, I think you've remedied my misunderstanding of the result. Thank you.
That's a kind. Thank you.
Does that also bring us to El Dorado? Are those themes?
One must talk about El Dorado, but Raj, you've been very patient with your hand up. So let's get that in. And indeed, I'm desperate to hear what you all think of what has always perplexed my students. What's this utopian chapter doing in a dystopian world?
Thank you, Dr. Course. I just wanted to point out two things, two subtleties, which I thought were. It's interesting. This book, is worthy of many readings because there are these gems that are hidden, and it's so we miss them. One of this is one which is less important is the one about the 72 quarterings. So I noticed that in my second time I read the first chapter was that Candide was not of humble birth. He could prove only 71 quarterings, the rest having been lost in the injuries of time. And then Cunegonde has 72. So it's kind of funny that one quartering is the difference. And so, of course, he cannot marry her. The other one, I think, other subtlety, which I think is philosophically very important, is that he doesn't say, Voltaire doesn't say that we should cultivate the garden. He says we should cultivate our garden.
Our garden, yeah. And if Candide is every man, or if Candide is read as every man in this, then we should cultivate the human garden. If the book is portraying the human condition, and Voltaire is every man in the human condition trying to make sense of things, how could the world possibly be this deranged? How could so much suffering, how could so many lives have so much unhappiness and pain in them and he reaches a conclusion for all of us. Right? We must cultivate our gardens.
Dr. Course, if I could just push my point, I respectfully submit that, it seems that the whole point is that you should not try to cultivate the human garden. Just mind your own business and cultivate your garden.
Oh, that's
how I interpreted it.
Yep. That's a very interesting way to read that. My reading depends on the reading of Candide as every man, the reading of what befalls Candide and those around him. If Candide is every man as the human condition, but if it's not meant to be generalized that way, right? If it's cultivate one's own private garden, so I guess if everyone is cultivating their own private garden, human beings are cultivating the human garden. But then it becomes, in effect, a presentation of a much more individualist way of looking at the ending of Candide. That's a very interesting reading.
We could have a whole course on this, course with a KORS. We could have a whole course on this. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd love to hear how you read the El Dorado section. What's it doing in there in the midst of all of this nightmare of the human condition? They stumble upon El Dorado. What do you make of it?
I didn't know what to make of it, but the observation I'll make is that after this series of nightmarish experiences, they arrive in El Dorado and then they quickly move along. So that seems to say something about human nature that confronted with this utopia, they just keep going. So I don't know what that suggests exactly, but that seemed important.
No, you've asked just the right question. Let's get other people in on this and see how El Dorado holds up. Who should be calling on people?
Yana?
Yeah, I thought that it's there because people need to hold some kind of ideal, even though things are horrible. But then the interesting part is that it's described as impossible to get to and impossible to leave from there, even though Candide and Pangloss, whoever he was with, they managed to get in there and they managed to leave. So that's what I was thinking, that you have to have something that that exists somewhere and we can strive toward it or whatever. But then I didn't understand, like, okay, well, why is it so impossible to get there, and why did these two? And they said Candide can make it there because he is the honest, innocent in a way person.
Those are such interesting observations because if you think about it, you're absolutely right. They don't plan to get to El Dorado. They're not thinking El Dorado. They stumble into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're on boats. The current takes them to El Dorado. And in the midst of a world of human suffering, absurdity, and injustice, what do they get? They get a glimpse of a different way of ordering human society. Mm-hmm. And it's almost Edenic, right? It's almost another Garden of Eden. But there's one thing. No one there is allowed a view of what's outside of El Dorado. As Lisa said, human nature for Voltaire is such, you put people in the Garden of Eden, and the first thing they think is, what can I do with this? What can I make of this, right? So they want the jewel from El Dorado. Right? What good is El Dorado unless you can show people? So sure, it's preposterous that we all go mad over gold and silver. Right? It's preposterous we have hierarchies. It's preposterous that to deal with the creator of nature, people think they need priests. But in this paradise, if you look outside, you're going to leave. So you're coerced into never being able to think of anything outside of El Dorado. What an observation on utopia. I'm talking too much and I want to hear you all. I'm sorry.
Sarah?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think El Dorado is there as a foil, something so different from the world that they're coming from. And I was going to point to page 49, where he says, if we remain here, we shall be just like everyone else. But if we return to the old world with only a dozen sheep loaded with our Eldoradian pebbles, we shall be richer than all the kings put together. We shall no longer have inquisitors to fear, and we shall easily rescue Cunegonde, or Cunegonde.
Cunegonde, but
Cunegonde.
I think you're exactly right. And if you think of the implications of that you could show human beings a paradise in which they don't have choice, and the restlessness of human ambition, of a human desire to stand out, to distinguish oneself, leads them to, what's good about
Except
it.
only our visitors feel that way, right? The residents there don't. They don't have that desire to leave. They don't.
They're not allowed to know there's a different world out there, right? They can't, it's not only that they can't leave, they can't look beyond the border. So it's an interesting utopia. You get a view of a world in which gold and silver don't matter. You get a view of a world in which people hold up pebbles of precious jewels and say, this is not important in life. You see people living with mutual respect, egalitarian kings who only want to do wonderful things for their people. You can get a view of that, but it's not something that ever could last. It's not something that ever could be a model for a different world. What a remarkable way to discuss utopia.
And it must have been pretty, I don't know, scandalous is the right word, but given the role of the priests at the time, to dismiss the idea of even having priests, to construct a society without them, and
that's right.
for everyone.
That if you think of an ideal world, he's writing for the readers in Catholic France. If you think of an ideal world, there are no monarchs with arbitrary power. People don't kill and devote their whole lives to silver and gold. And there are no priests. And that's just in there. That's built into the utopia. Human
and you
beings.
hug the king. You like, how do you greet the king? You hug him. You don't bend on your knee and kiss the ground he walks upon.
Yes, I think when they're introduced to the king and they want to know, should we get down on our knees? Do we kiss his boot? And it's, no, you hug and kiss him. There's a view of what human relationships to executive power in a society might look like, but that's not going to be in any world that we can reach and stay in, because it's not what we want. We have ambitions. We have strong desires. El Dorado will not satisfy them. And again, what happens? They get a glimpse, an accidental glimpse of a remarkably different world of values. But that world can only be sustained by coercion. You can't leave. You can't even look out. And so what do? They leave utopia.
And so just to be clear, you think Voltaire, that's Voltaire's opinion of human nature, that even in the face of utopia, we'll choose the other.
Okay. Staying in El Dorado has zero appeal to them. And don't forget, Cunegonde is not there. Right? So which would motivate one more? Lust and love on the one hand, or a desire to live in a utopian community on the other. Voltaire thinks that's not a contest.
Is that, is there an idleness built into the utopia? Is that part of the idea? So idleness as opposed to ambition? I'm just trying to, there's the classic Twilight Zone episode. I'm forgetting the title right now. Somebody probably knows. But the premise is that this guy goes to heaven and gets everything he wants, all the wealth, all the women, like everything he wants, but he becomes bored of it very quickly.
Well, we get a stunning example of that. We meet
Yeah.
Senator Poco Carante.
Yeah.
Right? Little motion, running very little. Senator Poe, he has everything.
Mhm.
He has absolutely everything. Magnificent library, magnificent home, anything he wishes in the world, and he's bored out of his mind in life. And that chapter on Senator Poco Carante becomes one of the most beloved chapters in Candide, and the calling someone a Poco Carante after Candide is out there becomes quite common. People who have everything, who have gotten what everyone else thinks they want in life. People who have everything that other people think, if I had that, I finally would be contented and happy, but he's miserable and bored. Senator Poco Carante, he is jaded. Nothing moves him. Nothing he reads moves him. No author moves him. He has everything, and that means he is nothing for Voltaire. One needs goals. One needs ambition. One needs to cultivate. And Senator Poco Carante, I think, illustrates exactly the point you were making there. It's a remarkable character in this book. Book's filled with remarkable characters.
Yeah.
And keep your eye on those priests in this book, right? They are some of the most remarkable.
Mhm.
He satirizes so many things in this book. Does any value unify those criticisms for Voltaire? Is there a consistent ethical criterion by which he's dismissive of monarchs and aristocrats and wars and Jesuit empire building? When he engages in social satire and criticism, because he's intensely a social critic, what are the ethical criteria? What really bothers him about what roles people are playing out there in the world? I see him, but I can't hear.
Raj, you had something?
Well, I was going to ask a broader question, but maybe I should try to respond to what Dr. Kors just asked. One of the things I think that he has a brilliant satire on is the hypocrisy of religion. It's very some of them are very amusing. So, for example, in El Dorado, he says, "What? You have no monks who teach, who dispute, who govern, who cabal, and who burn people that are not of their opinion?" So I thought that was funny. And then another one more subtle was elsewhere. He says, "A parson of the neighborhood came with great meekness to ask for a bill for the other world payable to the bearer."
Right.
Can I just do one more and then I'll stop? We had a very pious and humane imam who preached an excellent sermon exhorting them not to kill us all at once.
Right. And if you're a reader who's new to this kind of satire, reading Voltaire, you have to pause after lines like that, which readers do. And the number of times Voltaire is quoted by readers is from "Il faut cultiver notre jardin" to the kinds of responses you're citing that starts showing up in people's correspondence. They
Mm.
write each other. So these satires strike very deeply as people read them. Yeah.
This is the right place to ask my broader question, if I may, which is
Raj, can I just give other people a chance and then we'll come back
sure.
to you? Okay, great. And just quickly to follow up on that, the pithy phrases, like the capturing that sentiment in something short and retainable was astonishing to me. Like war as a million assassins in regimental formation. It's a powerful and almost beautiful phrase, but also satirical and humorous at the same time. Andrew.
So I've got a question kind of in general about satire and then apply that to Candide, and then also think about it in light of Gulliver's Travels, which I've read several times. How do you read satire and enjoy it without either becoming simply bitter and despairing or arrogant? Because if you're laughing at everything else, then it's like, oh, but I'm freed from that. I'm judging everything. And that kind of I wondered in general also about Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Was Voltaire influenced by that? And this ends up coming up, I think, in the last of his travels when he does visit a utopian society. He visits the horse land where the horses have this great utopia, and in the end, it makes him just hate human beings and be unable to even live with human beings when he returns. He's actually thrown out of the utopia. So anyway, those are my kind of general questions about satire.
These are stunning both questions and observations. For Voltaire, the bitterness of Martin the Manichaean tempts him, and the cynicism of Martin the Manichaean tempts him, but he can't stay with it. And the thing about Candide is he doesn't make the devastating, cynical conclusions ever. It is Martin who does. It's Cacambo who does. It's Jacques the Anabaptist. Two things about the names. I should just pause for a second. The Anabaptists, right? One of your heroic figures is Jacques the Anabaptist. The Anabaptists were a Christian heretical sect who become today's Mennonites, Amish. They are persecuted, they are extirpated by the sword because, among other things, they have very little respect for crowns, and they are pacifists, almost all of them pacifists. And they are the one thing that Lutheran, Calvinist, and Catholic can agree upon is the persecution of the Anabaptists. So when Voltaire chooses a sympathetic religious character, it's always either a Quaker or an Anabaptist, people who have experienced persecution. Manichaeanism, as I said, is this dualistic philosophy, theology, and Martin the Manichaean represents also a heresy that had been extirpated by the sword. The Albigensian Crusade in the south of France in the 13th century is directed against widespread Manichaean heresy. But they are the figures who make the pessimistic, the cynical, the how can one not have absolute contempt for human nature? It's not Candide. So it's very significant when it is Candide, not Martin, who is given the lesson of trying to live in this preposterous human condition in which we find ourselves in the 18th century. That's different from Swift. And I don't think there's a character quite the equivalent of a Candide who then surpasses at the end surpasses the narrator himself of the book. What an interesting question you've asked.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? The spirit of this book does seem critical and fundamentally critical. And from what you described, it seemed like Voltaire was working through his frustrations with this dominant philosophy, but that the Candide character gives a glimmer of hope, but not an answer to all of these. I mean, the answer is not being really presented here. More the
Candide is not going to give up, right? We're gonna keep working together. But the lesson of the contented family, they're cultivating a garden, in effect. And it may support the more individualistic reading. They're tending to their own needs in a world in which people seek to satisfy their own real needs without maliciously harming and abusing others. That's about the closest we come to a glimmer of hope. But think of the context of this in terms of European history and Voltaire's life, in terms of his life. I mean, this man who has sought to do so much finds himself exiled, ridiculed in Prussia, comes back. His pupil, Frederick the Great, has plunged Europe into war, and now Lisbon destroyed by earthquake. The sermons on, no, this is for the good. God is doing us a favor with the Lisbon earthquake. And then the Inquisition, he's in despair, Voltaire. He's lost in his own personal life so much. And he writes the poem on the Lisbon earthquake. Right? My respect to God, but my love to human beings. Can I account for the world without a creator? No. What does that have to do with the fact that whoever created this world has also created evil and suffering and despair? So let me turn my attention from God to the human condition. Because if there are any answers that are going to get us through, that's where the answers are. And that evokes Rousseau's wide, just universally read in the 18th century, letter to Voltaire on Providence, saying that Voltaire is denying human beings their only consolation, and he's written a work against God. Voltaire is livid toward Rousseau. He wants to answer. He begins Candide, and for the only time in his life, he hits a writer's block. He's writing slowly. He doesn't know where the work is going. And then once he gets toward the end of that book, there's a rush, and you can see it in his correspondence and indeed in the manuscript itself. The ending surprised him. It was going to be Martin's cynicism. It was going to be Martin's despair. And in the end, it's Candide's voice, all of our ordinary human voices that ring out. We're not going to solve the metaphysical issue of God and evil by denying evil. It exists. The world is a phantasmagoria. Let's change what we can change in the human condition. And at that moment in his life, when he finishes Candide, when that has come out of him, he turns toward crusade after crusade, slavery, serfdom, religious toleration, torture in the judicial system, unequal courts by various social statuses, religious hatreds. And in his 60s and 70s and into his 80s, Voltaire changes a culture sense of what it can alter and what it can reform in the human condition. This book is a very dramatic moment in the life of European civilization. Didn't mean to be climactic.
Well, if people still have other questions.
I do about the general philosophy he's refuting. What I found interesting throughout the book in what you were describing last time is they believe this is the best of all possible worlds, and they use that to rationalize any situation. You know, there's the scene where they're on the boat and the Anabaptist falls in and he says, well, just leave him. God meant for him to drown here in this harbor. And it seems interesting that they always seem to know what God intends, even though I thought this was all based off of not knowing what God intends. And that's why you can explain away the bad things. So was there an irony here that they didn't see? Like, was this not a contradiction that they were aware of or attuned to that?
I think this is the most powerful arguments that Voltaire sees himself making in this, that ultimately philosophical theological optimism equals fatalism in practice. If whatever is right, if for anything that happens, God has a reason. If nothing happens without its being part of an infinitely perfect being's plan for the world, then as is explained to, as Pangloss explains to Candide on the book, don't jump in after Jacques the Anabaptist to save him from drowning. If he doesn't drown, God had a reason for his not drowning. And if he drowns, God had a reason for his drowning. And if whatever happens, God has a reason for, then optimism equals fatalism. And Voltaire never has to make out the formal argument, optimism leads to fatalism. It's there built into the book, right? One of the biggest parts of philosophical optimism is what's called teleology. That things were created for a purpose, that we can do a science of purposes, right? Why did God put bees in the world? They have to be able to protect themselves with stingers in order to let agriculture flourish and keep the human species well fed and safe from absolute scarcity. What's a teleological argument that Pangloss makes in this book? God created noses so that we'd have a place to rest our eyeglasses. That kind of teleology, he makes no further argument there other than to state, right, Pangloss's sense. God gave us noses so we'd have somewhere to rest our, right? That's why we have these bridges up here. Needed a place to rest our spectacles. But what Voltaire is saying is that's what all teleological argument looks like. Striking.
Yeah, very. Massive.
I see a new hand up. Pat?
Oh, yes, Pat. Would you like to go first? No? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Pat?
Go ahead, Sabine.
Okay. Just going off of what Joseph asked, how can we know that what God intended was for Jacques to die by falling off the boat? Because couldn't we also say then God's intention was that Jacques should fall off the boat, but that Candide should be there to jump in after him and save him? So the idea that God intends things is such a dangerous one, isn't it?
But if Candide is not there to save him, then obviously the infinitely powerful, infinitely perfect being who created and who governs the world didn't intend him to be there. So for Voltaire, it's a bit as if one, let's say, looked at Auschwitz and someone said, this God had a reason for this, which is what significant numbers of theologians grapple with. And you will find the kinds of arguments still being made that Voltaire so responds to. For example, one will hear learned rabbis arguing that absent the Holocaust, there is no Israel. God had a purpose. But the other way to think of it is, once you think of this as a logical conclusion that always follows, then you're in the position of the child who, given, here, drink this, your mom says, right? And it's bitter, it tastes awful. She says, but this is what's going to make you better. You don't have to understand the science or the physiology of it. If you understand that your parents do things for a reason of your well-being, you drink the bitter medicine they give you. God has a reason. If you think you can have confidence that your parents, who you know are pretty flawed, right, that your parents have a good reason for what they're doing, even if you don't understand it as a child, just apply that argument to God. You think your parents have good reasons. Where do you look at God's mind? Right? But you can't do that. You can't discern his reasons, but you know he has them infinitely more than you know that your parents had good reasons for that bitter medicine. Where's our traffic cop?
Let's see. Pat, did you?
Thank you. One of the other participants put this in the chat, and I wanted to make sure he asked you, but he hasn't, so I'm going to ask it anyway. It has to do with your view on Galt's Gulch, comparing that to El Dorado.
Galt Gulch in El Dorado. I don't think Ayn Rand meant Galt Gulch is a place that human beings would flee from, and that they have to be forced to stay in by a coercive executive, no less. But it's interesting to look at utopia in Rand, utopia in Swift, utopia in Voltaire's Candide, and you find such striking differences, I think, in how Voltaire sees his utopia. Rand's utopia for her is a genuine utopia. Human nature isn't going to drive you out of it to go do something foolish the way human nature does for Voltaire. Does that address your question, Pat?
Beautifully. Thank you very much. I love it. Although I get the suspicion, though, that does that make Rand's utopia not a utopia? Because aren't all typical utopias coercive and take away free will?
I mean, the word itself means literally nowhere. So utopias are fictional nowheres, but usually presented, right, by more optimistic authors than Voltaire at this point. Utopias are usually presented as a model for things that can be attained, or that would be the ideal if attained. And I think Gulch is presented as a utopia that would be ideal if obtained, whereas Candide's El Dorado is not. Human nature is not going to stay there.
Elizabeth? Oh, we can't hear you, Elizabeth. You have to unmute. Joseph, are you able to unmute?
I got it. I got
Okay.
it. Okay, so thank you. You talked about the idea that a philosophical optimism leads to fatalism. Is there a way that that relates, that idea of that fatalism relates to what they call determinism? And is there some kind of connection between the idea of fatalism and the idea of determinism?
I think so. That's a really brilliant question, because the issue of freedom looms large, I think, in Candide. You see that dramatically in the Utopia, that the issue of freedom looms large. Rephrase your question for me. It's in the same way that between scoop 1 and scoop 3 these days, making myself coffee, I forget the number. If I take any digression in an answer, I forget the question.
I get it. Okay, so and I'm not exactly sure when the idea of determinism became prevalent, but my question is, if philosophical optimism leads to fatalism, how does that relate to the notion of what we call the current and the 19th century idea of determinism?
No, that's exactly what I hoped I would answer, and I went down a different path.
Okay.
The issue of determinism there is huge, because if we are living in a universe, the script for which has been written by God, if everything that occurs for a reason essential to God's plan, you've heard someone use the phrase before, pre-established harmony. That's a Leibnizian phrase, that God determined every last detail of the world. Why do you think that the decision you've made with your will has led to what you intended to have it lead to? It's because God has harmonized the world at the moment of creation. It was harmonized. This is pure Leibniz here. It was harmonized that when you pull something, even though you're pulling it is not the real cause of its moving, because everything is determined by God at the moment of creation. God established a harmony among things that just plays out over all time, such that when human beings make a decision, it's like two parts of a clock. There are the hands going around, and there is St. George, who comes out and strikes the dragon, creating the sound of the bell. We think that it's the hand of the clock that is causing St. George to come out and bang the bell. No, God created two mechanisms and harmonized them so that it looks like and life feels like the one causes the other. And in the Leibnizian system, in that optimistic philosophical justification of God's way with the world, there is no human freedom. There can't be human freedom, because God has predetermined every outcome of every event in the world so that this will be the best of all possible worlds. So it's not just fatalism, it's a fatalism that comes from knowing that all things have been preordained by God and were going to happen, and you should rejoice in that, because what could this be other than the best of all possible worlds? But thank you for that. I'm embarrassed that I went down a different path, because your question was lucid as could be. And it's a very deep question about Candide. Thank you.
That was a wonderful answer. Thank you.
Brian?
Yeah, some time ago, Dr. Kors, you asked what most bothered or motivated Voltaire. And perhaps by now you've answered it in many different ways. I was still trying to think if I could characterize, and I guess I was wondering, is it dogmatism, sophistry, and coercion? That's what I came up with. Is that anywhere near the truth?
I think so, and I think it's all of those. It's all of those, and someone earlier in discussion talked about his response to what are we talking about? Here I go again.
Well,
I think I retired just in time, frankly.
Yeah, the key things that bothered or motivated Voltaire.
Yes. Someone earlier spoke of hypocrisy. That it's not only that these things happen as you've described it, so but it happens with such hypocrisy. And we're enthralled to all of these authorities who don't even deal honestly with us.
Thank you.
I see a new hand, a Chad.
Hello. I'm going to try to formulate this. So on the El Dorado issue, I hear you speaking to all the elements of it emphasizing by contrast parts of human nature of needing free will and this being a problem, and we need goals and things to strive for. Now, when I was reading it, I got the sense that this was really mocking human nature because of the emphasis on it's kind of slipped in there, but in the way that Voltaire slips the important thing into sentences that, you know, they want to go back and show off these things. And they've got and they've got this place that they actually want to be in a certain sense. And they want to leave and go to a world that's absolutely horrific because now they can show off a couple of these things to people that are being horrific to them and everyone else for some reason.
Yes, and that's so interesting. If you look at what Voltaire's writing in the 1730s, a lot of it is a celebration of human ambition, of trade, of commerce, of material incentives, and the effect of that upon society. In Candide, where he is until he finishes this book, at his most pessimistic, at his most despairing, at his most unable to come to terms with his own place in the world and what he can and can't accomplish. This is when I get in trouble, by the way, when I spin off my rhetorical flights of fancy and try to remember, okay, what was the bread and butter? What was the bread and butter issue? Restate the last.
How do we read? So I'm conflicted with reading the El Dorado as mocking human nature, and how that fits in with it also emphasizing important kind of value-seeking elements of human nature.
I think that the view of human nature is part of his attempt to eviscerate Leibniz. Look at this world you're calling the best of all possible worlds. You look at our relations with our fellow species, fellow members of our species. They rob us, they abuse us. In the 1730s, merchants were a celebrated class in his letters from England. In Candide, merchants are dishonest. They rob, they steal. Right? The Dutch merchant who's going to transport Candide and his newfound wealth. So the view of human nature here is quite dark, which is very consistent with someone arguing, what are you conceivably saying when you call this the best of all possible worlds? And you remember that when they're sailing back to Europe, Martin the Manichaean and Candide are arguing, can human beings change? Can we be better than we are? And I'll forget the species he invokes, but Martin says, will a chicken hawk stop attacking chickens? And Voltaire writes, in effect, unable to convince the other, because who could be convinced on these ultimate metaphysical questions? Unable to convince each other, they argued all that way till they reached the coast of France. In the 1730s, England is the nation that has departed from all of the things that are keeping France back in a world that could be changed. When they reach the coast of England here, and this is a true event, the English are executing Admiral Byng for not having engaged the French in order to save men in what would have been a doomed battle. And Voltaire's phrase, the second most quoted line, is of all lines in Candide, is when he says the English are executing Admiral Byng, not because he necessarily, in their views, made a naval mistake, not being willing to see more of his men sacrificed, but pour encourager les autres, to encourage the other military leader, right? That one man is being executed to encourage the others. That's a very different England from the England portrayed in the 1730s by Voltaire. It's a very dark book, but emerging from that book, he has purged himself of something that's blocking him from getting on with his life, and getting on with his life will produce perhaps the one time in which the cliche, the pen is mightier than the sword, actually was true. It is before the French Revolution. It is as direct result of Voltaire's campaigns after Candide that serfdom is abolished in the provinces where it remains in France, that torture is abolished, that religious tolerance, Jews and Protestants, is enacted. All of that occurs before the French Revolution. It is a very different and freer Voltaire who emerges from the despair out of which Candide emerged. This has been a privilege being with all of you. If anyone has any final comments or questions, I'd love to hear them.
Nick, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, my question is more of a miscellaneous one. It's about the Poco Carante episode where he talks about his views of literature, specifically the great epic poets of the past and their works, like the Iliad and the Aeneid. My question is, me, myself, having read them for the first time pretty recently, like most of these things, I love them. And I find it difficult to read someone's view saying, yeah, they're actually like most of them are not that good. And they're kind of like, all over the place, or like they're doing these things that are ridiculous. I was just kind of wondering if you could provide some insight into his views on the epic poets and like the Iliad, the Aeneid, and Milton.
He has a very classical aesthetic, Voltaire. If you had asked him, if you'd put him on Truth Serum, what are people going to be reading by you in 100, 200, 300 years? He would have said my plays, and they're the most ignored part, and they're the pure embodiment of his classical aesthetic. And it's this polemical, philosophical tale like Candide, and he's written 10, 12 others that become his most popular genre. Candide, his most popular work, to further reinforce your doubts about his aesthetic credibility. He put Shakespeare pretty much in that same category of a wild writer, someone who lacked the sufficient aesthetic restraint, someone who overly overflowed what should be the appropriate forms and structures of literary communication. And he offered his own translations of little bits of Shakespeare that are chilling in their awfulness. To be or not to be, that is the question. My beloved Voltaire had the gall to translate that as être ou ne pas être, c'est là la question. And that c'est là la question gives you a pretty good idea of why he did not appreciate Shakespeare. I mean, he loved Shakespeare. He thought Shakespeare was aesthetically deficient. So those literary judgments of a classical playwright are a very interesting side thing. You would think that given the turn in the study of literature, that current scholars would get very interested in that. But almost no one pays attention to his aesthetic and his criteria of aesthetic judgment.
Can I quickly highlight another line from that section, which seems to relate to the broader question we were talking about just before? But so Candide wants this character to prove that happiness is possible, but that fails. And he says, but isn't there a pleasure in being critical, in discovering faults where other men think they see excellences? Which is to say, countered Martin, I love this line, that there is pleasure to be had in not taking pleasure. Oh, whatever you like, said Candide, in which case no one is happy but me when I see Mademoiselle Cunegonde again. One always does well to hope, said Martin. So it's just so interesting that Martin and Candide are in some ways become like they're rivals for the voice of Voltaire. And
yes.
So he seems to be criticizing the idea of only criticizing, only finding fault, and then allowing for a little bit of, Martin says cynically, one always does well to hope, but Candide ends up being the voice of hope at the end. So there's a truth to one always does well to hope that happiness is possible.
And if you're looking for, in some ways, the deepest, broadest implications of all of this in dealing with the sources of human well-being or human suffering, and what human beings might do, the gaze has gone from heavenward to earthward. And that's dramatic indeed.
One of the questions you raised was, how does this book fit in the optimism of the Enlightenment and such a negative view of...
Pause there for 1 second, and just to give background, an extraordinary number of survey books in European intellectual history and texts on the 18th century in discussing the French Enlightenment, and even after making Voltaire the central figure of the French Enlightenment, will describe the Enlightenment as having had, quote, a naive faith in human nature and human reason. Right? That's a standard view out there of the Enlightenment. I find it a false view, but if I were to provide what evidence for it being a false view, you have no better place to start than the most popular, widely read book by the most widely read author in the 18th century, Voltaire and Candide. And what is the view of human nature that emerges from it? Is it conceivably compatible with this textbook view of a French Enlightenment that has a naive faith in human nature and human reason? I've cut you off by trying to provide some context, but pick up right where you were, Joseph.
No, I think that's very helpful. And one thing I find when you were describing the view of human nature presented in Candide, I wonder if it was still successful because it's almost a template of what not to do, right? It's not that he's necessarily saying, because in a lot of ways he's anti-fatalistic, right? So he's not saying you will necessarily be this image of human nature, but hey, let's expose what humans can be so that now we can do something better. We can go end slavery and have religious tolerance, but we can only do that if we first purge the rest of it.
It's so that's such an interesting way to look at so much of this. If you look at the discussion of slavery, this, right? So brief, right? You see the Negro slave, right? Lost a leg from trying to escape, right? He's been so physically abused and tortured. And what's the comment about that? This is the price you pay for putting sugar in your coffee. This is the price we pay for the sugar we put in our coffee. How many readers stop there and think enough that it makes a difference, enough that it made a difference? There's no theoretical argument against slavery there, right? It's back to the word Lisa used earlier, juxtaposition. You juxtapose that slave and then throw in a line, the sugar in our coffee. And suddenly the reader has to see those two things. Voltaire is remarkable in an ability to do that. How do you take away the awe and sacred quality of monarchy? France, and everyone is taught it, France believes in the divine right of monarchy. God chooses king. Well, Voltaire gives us a dinner of 6 kings who have been deposed. Doesn't say, hey, you can get rid of kings, right? Doesn't say monarchy isn't quite God's view of the protection of monarchs isn't quite what you think. He just shows you a dinner of 6 actual deposed crowns. One can learn a lot about polemical technique reading Voltaire.
Elizabeth, and then we should probably wrap things up after that. We have to unmute again.
There we are. Okay. Okay, so it's just a small technical question. Would you translate that Shakespeare, the quote that Voltaire said about Shakespeare? The one about the question or la la, or how does that?
Yeah. If you think of in English, right, everyone's to be or not to be.
Right.
That is the question. Right?
Okay.
Then you get Voltaire's être ou ne pas être. C'est là la question. Right? C'est là, there is, right, the question, but to have a la in that phrase is so appalling to anyone who loves Shakespeare. And to have it at all sing-song is almost the opposite of Shakespearean prosody. So very, very revealing 18th century classical. One thing I want to stress is this role of Martin the Manichaean, though. I alluded to the great debate as they're coming back to France on page 59, right? The end of chapter 21. Here is the kind of philosophical discussion you're supposed to have in France in the 18th century. But it can't lead anywhere, is Voltaire's. So you get, do you think, said Candide, that men have always massacred one another as they do today? That they have always been, and now you get his account of human nature, liars, cheats, traitors, ingrates, and brigands, as well as weaklings, shirkers, cowards, backbiters, gluttons, drunkards, misers, and social climbers, In addition to being bloodthirsty, slanderous, fanatical, debauched, hypocritical, and downright stupid. But don't you accept, replied Martin, that hawks have always killed pigeons when they come across them? Without a doubt, said Candide. Well then, said Martin, if hawks have always had the same nature, why do you expect men to change theirs? Oh, said Candide, but there is a crucial difference, because free will, and philosophizing thus, they arrived in Bordeaux. And you get the sense they could philosophize thus without resolution to the next stage of their lives till the end. But the one thing we know, we must cultivate our garden. You all have been a delight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And are we planning to meet for one more session next week?
I'd be glad to if people are
Glad
willing.
to. Okay, so
I still have many questions.
you still have many
So
questions.
I hope so.
We'll meet again at 9 a.m. next Saturday. And thank you very much for your leadership through this discussion. And I look forward to talking to everyone more next week.
Love it.
Thank you, Dr.
so much.
Force. And thank you, Lisa and Joseph.